The air was heavy with sorrow as the flag-draped casket was slowly carried toward its final resting place. Rows of solemn faces stood in silence, hands clasped, some gripping tissues, others standing rigid in military precision. The wind carried the distant echo of church bells, a stark contrast to the quiet grief that blanketed the cemetery. Sergeant Daniel Briggs had been many things: a soldier, a leader, a friend. But to those gathered here, he was more than just a war hero. He was family. His brothers in arms, men who had stood beside him in battle, now stood shoulder to shoulder one last time, their crisp uniforms stiff in the afternoon sun. His family, seated in the front row, stared at the casket, their eyes glassy with unshed tears. Tom Reynolds, Daniel's closest friend, kept his eyes locked on the casket, his hands clenched into fists. They had been through too much together, had seen too many friends buried before their time. He wanted to believe Daniel was still out there, still cracking jokes in that rough, gravelly voice of his. But this was real. Then something shifted. A murmur passed through the crowd, subtle at first, but growing as heads turned toward the back of the cemetery. Tom frowned, following their gaze. Standing just beyond the final row of mourners, near the line of trees that bordered the cemetery, was a dog, a German shepherd. He stood tall, ears pricked forward, his dark eyes locked onto the casket. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. Tom's brow furrowed. His first thought was that the dog belonged to someone attending the funeral, but as he scanned the crowd, no one held a leash. No one called for him. And yet, there was something about the way he stood there, completely still, his gaze unwavering. Something eerily familiar. The priest continued speaking, but the presence of the dog did not go unnoticed. A few people whispered among themselves. Someone reached out to touch Tom's arm, as if to ask if he knew where the dog had come from. Tom shook his head. The ceremony moved on. The honor guard prepared their rifles for the three-volley salute. Still, the German shepherd did not move. The dog wasn't just watching, he was waiting. And though no one knew why, an undeniable weight settled over Tom's chest, because in the quiet depths of his mind, a single thought surfaced. Daniel had told him once about a dog he had lost a long time ago, a dog that, if he was still out there, would have never stopped searching for him. The wind stirred through the cemetery, rustling the neatly folded flag atop Daniel Briggs's casket. The chaplain's voice carried over the silent gathering, his solemn words honoring a soldier who had given everything for his country. A few sniffles could be heard, a hushed murmur of grief among the family, but for the most part the funeral remained still. Except for him, the German shepherd hadn't moved. He stood in the same spot at the tree line, watching with an eerie intensity, his amber eyes never straying from the casket. His body was rigid, disciplined, but his tail remained low, a quiet sadness in his stance. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Whose dog is that? Was he Daniel's?" "No, I don't think so." Tom, standing near the front, caught bits and pieces of the hushed conversation. His gaze flicked back to the dog, unease creeping up his spine. Stray dogs didn't just wander into a cemetery and stand at attention like that. He knew dogs, especially working dogs, and everything about this one told him it wasn't here by accident. Still, no one approached him. The honor guard stepped forward, rifles lifted in perfect sync. A breathless pause filled the air before the first volley rang out. Bang! The German shepherd didn't flinch. Bang! His eyes remained locked on the casket, his ears flicking forward ever so slightly. Bang! Most dogs would have bolted at the first shot, startled by the sudden burst of sound. But not this one. He stood firm, as if he had heard it 100 times before. Tom's grip on his dress hat tightened. His heartbeat was steady, but something about this felt off. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made his gut twist with an emotion he couldn't name. The service moved on, the folded flag was handed to Daniel's grieving mother, and the final words were spoken. One by one, guests began to step away, murmuring condolences, walking back toward their cars. Still, the dog did not move. The crowd thinned. The family left. The honor guard packed up their rifles and marched away. Yet as the last of them turned toward the exit, the German shepherd remained, his gaze unwavering, his paws planted firmly on the ground. Tom lingered. He watched as the dog slowly stepped forward, his nails clicking against the stone walkway. Step by step, he moved toward the casket, his eyes never leaving the grave. It was then that Tom realized this dog wasn't waiting for someone. He was mourning. The precise movements of the honor guard filled the silent cemetery as they carefully folded the American flag, each motion deliberate, each crease sharp. The air was still, thick with grief, as Daniel Briggs' mother sat with trembling hands, waiting to receive the flag that had draped her son's casket. A soldier kneeled before her, offering the folded triangle with solemn reverence. "This flag is presented on behalf of a grateful nation," he said, his voice steady despite the sorrow that hung over the service. She clutched it to her chest, her shoulders shaking as silent tears fell. And still the German shepherd stood there. No one had approached him, not yet, but the weight of his presence pressed on everyone who remained. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was moving. Slowly, with calculated steps, he walked toward the casket. A soft murmur rippled through the remaining guests as they noticed. Heads turned, brows furrowed in confusion. The dog moved with a quiet confidence, his posture controlled but heavy with something that no one could quite name. Tom stiffened. He had seen military canines before, dogs that had served in war, that had been trained for discipline, protection, and loyalty. But something about this one was different. There was no hesitation in his steps, no uncertainty in his stance. He wasn't just a dog wandering into the wrong place. He belonged here. A funeral attendant hesitated before stepping forward, his hand slightly raised. "Come on, buddy," he said gently, his voice careful, as if speaking to a lost pet. "Let's get you out of here." The German shepherd didn't move. The attendant reached out a little more, but the moment his hand came near, the dog let out a deep, low rumble. Not aggressive, not threatening, but a warning. A few family members gasped softly. "Does he belong to someone?" a voice whispered. "Was he Daniel's?" "No. He never mentioned a dog." Tom took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving the animal. The shepherd stood just a few feet away from the casket now. His ears twitched slightly as the last notes of the funeral hymn faded into silence. His gaze remained locked on the casket, his expression unreadable, but his body language spoke louder than words. He was here for a reason, and no one, not the attendants, not the mourners, not even the honor guard, was going to move him. Tom swallowed hard, something tugging at the edges of his memory. He had seen this kind of devotion before, and he had a sinking feeling that Daniel had too. The cemetery had emptied slowly, mourners trickling out in small groups, murmuring quiet condolences as they left. The honor guard had completed their duties, their crisp uniforms fading into the distance. The only sounds that remained were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the rhythmic breathing of the lone German shepherd standing by the grave. Tom Reynolds hadn't moved. He stood near the casket, watching the dog, a strange unease creeping through his chest. The animal hadn't left, hadn't wavered, hadn't so much as glanced at anyone else. His focus remained solely on Daniel's final resting place. Tom swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his side. He'd seen dogs like this before, loyal, disciplined, trained for something more than the average pet. There was an unmistakable presence about them, a weight that went beyond simple companionship. The longer he watched the shepherd, the more something tugged at the back of his mind. A conversation from years ago, a story Daniel had once told him over drinks after a deployment. "He saved my life, you know," Daniel had said, his voice lower than usual, that distant look in his eyes that only veterans carried. "I was pinned down, bleeding out. I thought that was it. And then, out of nowhere, he was there, pushing forward, dragging me out of the dirt." "A medic?" Tom had asked, confused. "No," Daniel had smirked, shaking his head. "A dog. K9 unit. Smart as hell. Loyal. They called him Ace. But we lost him in that last op. He disappeared in the chaos. Never found a body, never got closure. Damn dog was more of a soldier than half the guys I served with." Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the memory played out. His eyes flicked back to the German shepherd. It couldn't be. Ace was lost overseas years ago. But then Tom took a step forward, narrowing his gaze. There, just beneath the shepherd's left ear, half hidden by thick fur, was a scar, a faint, jagged mark. Tom's breath hitched. Daniel had mentioned that scar, a reminder of a near miss, a bullet that had grazed Ace's head during a firefight. His stomach clenched. This wasn't coincidence. He wasn't sure how. He wasn't sure why. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that the dog standing before him, watching over Daniel, even in death, was no ordinary stray. This was Ace, and somehow, against all odds, he had found his way back. The dry desert air had been thick with dust and smoke, the acrid scent of burning metal clinging to every breath. Gunfire cracked through the valley, echoing off the jagged cliffs as Sergeant Daniel Briggs pressed his body against the crumbling wall of a bombed-out building. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady as they gripped his rifle. Ace was right beside him, his body tense, ears pinned forward, waiting for Daniel's next command. The German shepherd's fur was streaked with dirt, his sharp amber eyes scanning the battlefield. He wasn't just a dog, he was a soldier, trained to detect threats before they could strike. Then it happened. The explosion. It was sudden, violent, a fireball erupting from a hidden IED just a few yards ahead. The force of it sent Daniel flying backward, his head slamming into the ground, his vision darkening at the edges. The world spun, the deafening ring in his ears drowning out the shouts of his unit. Through the chaos, one word tore from his throat. Ace! He barely saw it, just a blur of fur vanishing into the dust cloud. Daniel tried to push himself up, his ribs screaming in protest. His ears caught the frantic calls of his squad, the crunch of boots scrambling over debris, but he only had one focus. Ace, his partner, his protector, gone. He fought against the arms that pulled him back, his vision still swimming as his teammates dragged him behind cover. He shouted Ace's name again, straining against the grip of his brothers in arms, but all he got in response was more gunfire. The firefight raged on. Minutes stretched into eternity. By the time the smoke cleared, the battlefield was silent. Daniel pushed himself up, ignoring the pain, ignoring the warnings from his CO. He stumbled forward, scanning the wreckage, his pulse thundering in his ears. Ace had to be here. He had to be alive. But there was nothing, only silence, no barking, no movement. Nothing. A hand clapped onto his shoulder, grounding him. He turned to see his commanding officer's grim expression. "We have to go, Briggs." Daniel clenched his jaw, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and denial. "He's still out there." The officer hesitated before shaking his head. "I know, but we can't stay." And that was it. That was the moment he lost Ace. The moment he was forced to turn his back on his best friend, leaving him behind in the endless stretch of desert, wondering, praying, that somehow, some way, Ace had survived. And now, years later, standing in front of Daniel's grave, Ace had come back. The cemetery was nearly empty now. The last of the mourners had left, their quiet whispers fading into the wind. The honor guard had departed, the flag folded and placed in Daniel's mother's trembling hands. Only the casket remained, resting beneath the weight of finality. And the dog. He hadn't moved from his spot. His body was still, his head bowed as if in quiet mourning. The only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, but even that felt distant. All that existed in this moment was the dog and the grave. Tom couldn't tear his eyes away. Slowly, he took a step forward, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoe the only indication that time was still moving. The dog didn't flinch. He simply stood there, unwavering, his gaze locked on the polished wood of the casket. Tom swallowed, his throat dry. The weight in his chest tightened as he knelt, leveling himself with the animal. It was one thing to suspect, to wonder, to let his mind drift to impossible conclusions. It was another to see the truth staring back at him. Amber eyes. They were sharp, intelligent, filled with something more than just instinct. They weren't just the eyes of a dog. They were the eyes of a soldier. The same kind of eyes Daniel had carried after their last tour, after too many things had been lost. And then, beneath the thick fur of the shepherd's jaw, Tom saw it, A scar, faint but unmistakable. A jagged line running just beneath the left ear, barely visible unless you were looking for it. But Tom had heard about that scar before. He had seen Daniel run his fingers over the spot in an absent motion as he told the story, his voice thick with something unspoken. The bullet barely missed, took a chunk out of him, but he didn't even flinch, kept moving, kept fighting. He was always stronger than me. Tom felt his heart pound against his ribs, his pulse deafening in his ears. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. But as he stared into those amber eyes, the same ones Daniel had described all those years ago, he knew this wasn't just a dog who had wandered into the funeral. This was Ace, and somehow, some way, he had found his way back to Daniel, to say goodbye. The murmurs started as a ripple, soft, uncertain, spreading through the small crowd that remained near the grave. The last of Daniel's family members had been on their way to their cars, but now they paused, glancing back. A few officers in dress uniform exchanged uneasy looks. No one spoke too loudly, but the weight of their stares pressed in like an unspoken question. Tom swallowed hard, his throat tight as he turned back to the German Shepherd. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't acknowledged the voices around him. His focus remained on the casket, on Daniel. Tom forced himself to find his voice, though it felt like gravel in his throat. This is Ace. The words felt foreign the second they left his lips. They tasted impossible. And yet, as they hung in the air, the weight of them settled deep into his bones. Someone scoffed softly behind him. Tom, a fellow veteran, Jackson, stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. That's not possible. Ace went missing years ago. I know, Tom said. Though his voice lacked conviction, his hand hovered over the shepherd's thick fur. He still hadn't touched him, still hadn't closed that final gap. But look at him. A woman, Daniel's sister, spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe he just looks like him. Tom's breath came faster. No. His head shook, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. You don't understand. Look at his eyes. Look at the way he's standing. I know that scar. Daniel told me about it. And this dog... He hesitated, running a hand down his face before turning to the only one who mattered. Ace! The dog's ears flicked, his body tensed. And then, he moved. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. Ace stepped forward, his movements careful, deliberate. His massive frame shifted in front of Daniel's casket, planting himself like a sentry. His tail was low, his head slightly bowed, not in submission, but in something else, something deeper. A soldier's mourning. The whispers behind Tom grew louder. That can't be. Dogs don't just show up after years like this. This doesn't make sense. Tom's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He didn't care what made sense. He didn't care what logic dictated. All he knew was that Ace was here, that after all these years, after Daniel spent his life wondering what had happened, after carrying the weight of guilt over losing him, Ace had found his way back, and he wasn't leaving. Tom's hands were shaking as he pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow over his fingers as he scrolled through the endless sea of memories, photos taken in another lifetime, a lifetime filled with dust, sand, and the unwavering presence of a soldier in his K9. The whispers around him had quieted, but the tension remained thick in the air. Mourners stood frozen, their gazes darting between Tom and the German Shepherd, standing guard before Daniel's casket. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't wavered. He remained where he was, solid as stone, silent as the grave he watched over. Tom's breath caught as he found what he was looking for. The photo. It had been taken years ago, somewhere overseas, the desert sky burning gold behind them. Daniel stood in his fatigues, dust clinging to his sleeves, his arm resting over the broad shoulders of his partner. And there, sitting at his side, ears perked, amber eyes burning with the same fierce intelligence, was Ace. Tom turned the screen toward the crowd. Look, his voice cracked as he spoke. Look at him. A few people hesitated, stepping closer. The comparison was undeniable. The same dark saddle markings stretched across the shepherd's back. the same piercing gaze, and the scar. A jagged line just beneath his left ear, faint but unmistakable. A woman covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes widening. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Tom's throat was tight. He turned the phone slightly, angling it toward the dog. Ace's head lifted. For the first time since the ceremony began, his gaze shifted. Slowly, deliberately, his eyes landed on the image. Tom felt his breath hitch. Ace let out a low, broken whimper. The sound was soft but heavy, filled with something unspoken. Recognition, sorrow, something deeper than words could capture. A cold shiver ran through Tom's spine. He wanted to doubt. He wanted to rationalize it. But there was no denying what was right in front of him. This was Ace, Daniel's Ace. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. He had found his way back. And now, after all these years, he had come to say goodbye. The weight of it all settled over the cemetery like an invisible force, pressing down on the air, thick with something beyond grief, something unspoken, yet undeniably real. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. They only watched. Ace stood before the casket, his amber eyes locked on the polished wood, his ears twitching slightly as if waiting for a command he would never hear again. A breeze passed through the trees, rustling the grass, but Ace didn't react. Tom felt something tighten in his chest. The dog had never stopped looking. The realization hit him like a gut punch, knocking the breath from his lungs. Somehow, against all odds, Ace had spent years searching for the one man who had been his entire world. Whether it was instinct, fate, or something beyond human understanding, he had found him, not in life, but in death. The cemetery had never felt so quiet. The people who had doubted, who had whispered that it wasn't possible, now stood frozen, watching as the German shepherd took one slow step forward, then another. And then, with a heavy exhale, Ace lowered himself to the ground. His massive frame pressed against the earth, his head resting gently beside the headstone that bore Daniel's name. The air grew thick with emotion. Ace closed his eyes. He had searched. He had waited. Now, his duty was done. Tom swiped a hand down his face, trying to hold back the burning behind his eyes. A soldier's loyalty was forever. A bond like theirs didn't break, not with time, not with distance, not even with death. Ace had come to say goodbye the only way he knew how, by staying. No one spoke. No one tried to move him. For the first time in years, Ace was home. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Most of the mourners had drifted away, their whispers lost to the wind, but one figure remained unmoving. Ace, the German shepherd, lay silent, his massive frame still curled beside Daniel's grave, his body half pressed against the earth, as if he could will himself closer to the man he had spent his life protecting. He had found his way back after all these years, and now he refused to leave. Tom stood a few feet away, watching, his hands curled into fists at his sides. His throat was thick, his heart aching with something deeper than grief. This wasn't just loyalty. This was something more. A bond that had defied time, distance, even death. A quiet sound broke through the stillness. Footsteps. Tom turned as one of the older veterans, a man who had served alongside Daniel years ago, stepped forward. His weathered hands moved slowly as he reached for the patch on his sleeve. The insignia of his unit, the one he had worn through deployments, through war, through everything that made a soldier who they were. Without hesitation, he knelt, pressing the patch gently onto the grass beside Daniel's headstone. "For both of them," the man murmured. No one spoke. Tom swallowed hard, the weight of it all pressing against his ribs. Ace didn't react at first, his breathing steady, his body still. But then, as if sensing the gesture, he lifted his head just slightly. His deep amber eyes flickered toward the patch, then back to the grave. Tom took a slow step forward. "Ace," he said, his voice low, steady. The German shepherd's ears twitched, but he didn't move. "You found him," Tom continued, his voice breaking slightly. "You did your job, buddy." Ace exhaled, the sound barely audible. Tom's chest tightened. It would be so easy to leave him here, to let him stay in the only place he had been searching for all these years. But he couldn't. Ace wasn't meant to be left behind, not again. Tom took another step, kneeling beside the dog. He placed a gentle hand on his back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing. "It's time to go," he murmured. Ace hesitated. For one long moment, he stayed still. Then slowly, he lifted his head, his gaze lingering on Daniel's name one last time, and then, with a deep breath, he pushed himself up. Tom stepped back, his chest tight as Ace turned. His movements were slow but deliberate. He took one step, then another, away from the grave, away from the past, but never forgetting. As Ace took his final steps away from Daniel's grave, the weight of his journey lingered in the air. He had never given up, never stopped searching, and in the end, he had fulfilled his final mission to say goodbye. But now a new chapter awaited. Some bonds are unbreakable. Some loyalty never fades. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Honor the heroes, both human and K9, by sharing this with someone who understands the depth of this bond, because these stories deserve to be told.